In a small town in the Philippines, a shy boy named Mateo stepped onto a stage, clutching his old guitar. His clothes were worn, his shoes too big, and whispers rippled through the crowd. Some laughed, some smirked, convinced he was out of place. But behind Mateo's nervous smile was a voice that would soon silence them all. The town auditorium buzzed with chatter as families and friends filled the rows of old wooden chairs. It was a local talent show, an evening where children showcased dances, songs, and skits. The air was warm, fans whirred on the ceiling, and the crowd's mood was light, almost playful. When Mateo's name was called, the atmosphere shifted slightly. A small, barefoot boy walked slowly onto the stage, clutching a guitar that looked too big for his thin frame. His shirt was faded, patched in places, and his trousers hung loose, rolled up at the cuffs. The spotlight made him squint, and for a moment, he froze in the center of the stage, scanning the sea of expectant faces before him. Then came the whispers. "Who is he?" someone murmured. "Look at his clothes," another giggled. A group of teenagers in the back snickered, their laughter echoing through the room. Mateo's ears burned red, and his hands trembled as he adjusted the guitar strap. The sound of muffled laughter grew sharper, like tiny arrows piercing his courage. He swallowed hard, wishing he could disappear into the shadows. For a second, he considered running back to the safety of the alleys where he often sang for coins, where no one expected perfection. But then, like a whisper carried on the wind, he remembered his mother's words, "When you sing, don't be afraid. Sing from your heart, and they will feel it." She used to tell him that under the stars, when he was too afraid to sing even for her. That memory steadied him. He tightened his grip on the guitar, took a shaky breath, and stepped closer to the microphone. His eyes darted to the judges' table, 3 adults watching him with polite curiosity, though one raised an eyebrow skeptically. The laughter from the audience hadn't stopped completely, but Mateo forced himself to look past them, fixing his gaze on the darkened back of the hall. Inside, his heart hammered like a drum, but somewhere beneath the nerves, a spark of determination flickered. He hadn't come this far to let fear win. He had a song to sing, a story to tell. The crowd still chuckled, but Mateo closed his eyes, readying himself for the first note. Because in just a few seconds, everything was about to change. The room was still buzzing when Mateo finally strummed the first chord. The sound was soft, almost fragile, and some in the crowd leaned forward, straining to hear. A few snickers lingered, but then his voice rose, a gentle, trembling note that seemed too rich, too soulful to come from such a small, weary boy. The laughter faltered. Mateo's voice carried a depth beyond his years, raw and unpolished but filled with emotion. The cracks in his tone weren't mistakes, they were truths, carrying the weight of nights spent hungry, the ache of loneliness, and the fragile thread of hope that had kept him alive. The crowd shifted. Parents stopped whispering to their children. A man in the front row lowered his phone, no longer scrolling. Even the group of teenagers who had laughed earlier went quiet, their smirks fading as the boy's voice wove through the hall like a prayer. On stage, Mateo kept his eyes closed. He didn't dare look at the faces staring back at him. Instead, he thought of the alleys where he used to sing, of the coins that sometimes clinked into his tin, of the stars that listened when no one else would. In his mind, he wasn't standing in a crowded hall anymore. He was singing to his mother, to the memory of her gentle lullabies that once made him feel safe. The notes grew stronger, steadier. His small fingers danced over the strings with surprising grace, as though the battered guitar was an extension of his soul. The audience could hear it, the sincerity, the purity of a child who had nothing but a song to offer. Then, in the silence between verses, something remarkable happened. A woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. A father reached for his daughter's hand. Strangers who had been ready to dismiss him now leaned forward, caught in the spell of his voice. The very people who had laughed minutes ago were now fighting back tears. By the time Mateo's voice soared into the chorus, the hall was transformed. The laughter was gone, replaced by a reverent stillness. His music had taken hold of every heart in the room. For the first time in his life, Mateo wasn't just a boy on a stage. He was a storyteller, singing his pain, his hope, his dreams into the world. And everyone was listening. By the time Mateo reached the second chorus, the hall was no longer a place of mockery. It had become a sanctuary. His voice, fragile yet soaring, filled every corner of the room with something that words alone could never capture: truth. The judges leaned in, their earlier skepticism washed away. One placed a hand over their heart, visibly moved. Another simply shook their head in disbelief, their eyes glistening. And Simon, the most difficult to impress, sat utterly still, his eyes locked on the boy as though he was witnessing something rare, something sacred. Mateo sang with his whole being. His eyes were closed, his expression raw. Each lyric seemed to carry a memory: the nights he went to bed hungry, the times he felt invisible, the moments he wanted to give up but didn't. The audience could hear it all, not just in the melody, but in the cracks of his voice, in the aching sincerity behind each note. Then it happened. The first tear fell, not from Mateo, but from the crowd. A mother in the second row wiped her cheeks, overwhelmed by the thought of her own children. A man who had laughed earlier now lowered his head, ashamed of his quick judgment. Around the room, shoulders trembled, tissues appeared, and a wave of silent tears rippled through the audience. The camera panned across the judges' table. One judge whispered, "This isn't just singing. This is a cry from the soul." Another nodded, unable to speak. Simon's lips curved, not into his usual smirk, but into the faintest smile of respect. On stage, Mateo's voice cracked as he hit the final lines. He clutched his guitar tighter, pouring out every ounce of strength he had left. The room held its breath, as though no one dared interrupt. And then, silence. The last note lingered, floating through the air like a prayer answered. For a heartbeat, no one moved. No one clapped. It was as if the audience needed time to process what had just happened. Then, like a dam breaking, the entire hall erupted into applause. People leapt to their feet, cheering, crying, clapping until their hands stung. It was a standing ovation, thunderous and unstoppable. Mateo finally opened his eyes. He saw them, every tear, every smile, every hand raised in awe. And for the first time in his life, he felt it deep inside. He was no longer invisible. He had been seen. The standing ovation thundered through the theater, but Mateo could hardly move. His small hands clutched the neck of his battered guitar, his eyes wide, his chest heaving with disbelief. For so long, he had sung for passing strangers who barely noticed him. Now, the entire hall was on its feet, cheering as if they had always known his name. One judge leaned forward, her voice breaking. "Mateo, you reminded us all what music is truly about. Not perfection. Not fame. But heart. You sang from a place so deep and honest that we couldn't help but feel every word." The audience roared in agreement, but then the hall grew quiet, because everyone was waiting for Simon Cowell. He had been the hardest to read, sitting with his arms crossed, eyes unblinking, studying the boy with unusual intensity. Finally, Simon spoke, his voice steady. "Mateo, when you first walked onto this stage, I didn't know what to expect. You're small, your guitar is worn, and people laughed. But the second you sang, everything changed. You didn't just perform, you shared your soul. And I believe millions will never forget what you just did." Gasps rippled through the audience as Simon slowly stood up. His hand hovered above the golden buzzer, the symbol of rare, life-changing recognition. The crowd began to chant, "Press it. Press it." Simon glanced back at Mateo, his expression softening. "Sometimes the world needs a reminder," he said, "that greatness can rise from the humblest places." Then, he slammed his hand down on the golden buzzer. The theater erupted. Golden confetti rained down like a storm of stars, showering the stage in light. Mateo dropped his guitar, his tiny hands flying to his face as tears streamed down. He fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the moment, his sobs drowned out by cheers and applause. Simon walked onto the stage and knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You are special, Mateo," he whispered. "And the world knows it now." For the first time in his life, the boy who once sang unseen on the street stood bathed in golden light, no longer invisible, forever unforgettable. When the last pieces of golden confetti were swept from the stage, Mateo's life was forever changed. Overnight, the boy who once sang on the streets of Manila for coins became a global inspiration. News outlets replayed his performance, calling it the voice that silenced the laughter. Social media exploded with millions of shares, and messages of support poured in from across the world. Back in his old neighborhood, families huddled around a small TV, cheering as they saw the barefoot boy they once passed on street corners now standing tall under the world's brightest lights. Many wiped away tears, realizing they had overlooked his gift when it was right in front of them. He was no longer just a homeless child with a battered guitar, he was living proof that dreams could survive even the harshest of realities. But fame wasn't what changed Mateo most. It was kindness. Letters arrived from strangers who had been moved by his courage, some offering food, shelter, or music lessons, others simply writing, "You gave me hope." For the first time, Mateo understood his voice was more than survival, it was a bridge that connected people, no matter their background. Weeks later, in an interview, a reporter asked, "What do you want to do with this opportunity?" The audience expected him to say he wanted riches, a house, or fame. But Mateo shook his head softly. "I want to help kids like me," he said, his voice trembling yet firm. "Kids who don't have a home, but still have dreams." That moment struck as deeply as his song. He wasn't just singing for himself anymore, he was singing for every unseen child, every unheard voice. Soon, with the support of his new platform, Mateo began visiting shelters, sharing his story, and performing for children who needed to believe that their lives, too, could change. He sang not for coins, but to inspire. Each note was a promise, that even in the darkest corners, there was light waiting to be found. His journey wasn't about winning a TV show, it was about proving something bigger, that no dream is too small, no voice too weak, and no child too forgotten. Mateo's song began on the streets, but it echoed across the world, reminding millions that compassion, courage, and hope can turn even the quietest voice into something unforgettable.